Hello and welcome to the Amiga Ireland podcast. Me today is Rob.
Hello.
And Luke.
Hello.
Anyone who does any kind of work with Amiga, whether using applications or installing libraries or software development, has heard of Snoop-DOS. It's a legendary application. And in our previous interview with Rob Cranley, we learned that the author of Snoop-DOS is actually an Irishman, and he's with us today. Eddy Carroll, hello, and thanks for joining us.
Hi guys, it's very good of you to ask me to join you. I'm looking forward to reliving some of the Amiga memories.
Likewise. Can you tell us about your introduction to computing and Commodore?
Sure. I went to school in Booterstown in Dublin, and it was quite progressive at the time because the government had decided that every school was going to have its own Apple II. But in this particular school, the guy in charge of the computers decided that wasn't going to do it. So he got funding and fundraising and so on, and bought a couple of Commodore PETs, and then continued to buy them. And we ended up with probably about 15 Commodore PETs, all networked together using a thing called HydroNet, which was a very early local area network that ran over serial ports. And there was a computer club. So fifth years were the people who did computer classes, but there was a computer club that ran in the afternoon, and anyone who wanted to could go along. So when I was in first year at school, I heard about this, and I went along one September, and it was an absolutely tiny room. So literally no room even to turn around. So you had people sitting at keyboards, and then everyone else standing looking over their shoulder, which is what I was doing. And so I stood there one evening, and I was looking over somebody's shoulder, and they typed in a simple basic program, and I was looking at it and I was like, wow, I can see how that works. That's unbelievable. And I was basically hooked. So I started spending most of my time there. And a few months later, I managed to persuade my parents to get a VIC-20 for Christmas, which would have been, I think, Christmas 1981. And that was really the end of my childhood from then on. So the VIC was followed a year later by Commodore 64, and then a couple of years after that, a Commodore 128. And around about that same time, the Commodore Users Group of Ireland was formed, and there was a letter in one of the local papers saying if anybody was interested in forming a group, come along to this address at this time. And off I went with a few friends, and we ended up on the founding committee. And that ran from, I think, maybe 1982, 1983 up until 96, so probably about 13, 14 years. That was a great resource because you had like-minded people. We had some people with a bit of hardware expertise, programmers, people who just enjoyed playing with computers, people who enjoyed playing with games. We designed our own cartridges, so you could plug into the back of the Commodore 64, and we had an EEPROM programming kit, and we'd figured out how to make cartridges and all kinds of good stuff like that. So that was great fun. So from there, I picked up assembly language. There was a book that Nick Hampshire wrote on the VIC called, I think, VIC Revealed, and it was a very technical book, and it jumped straight into 6502 assembly language without really much introduction. Mm-hmm. And on the VIC, which only had 3.5K of memory, so it wasn't huge, the only way you could get assembly language in was by literally poking it in one byte at a time. So you would have these basic programs, which were just lists of numbers and a little for loop that would read through all the numbers and poke them into some reserved bit of memory. And you typed them all in. If you made a single mistake in any of the numbers, well, that was unfortunate. You would find out fairly quickly because it would crash. And of course, because it crashed, you just lost everything. So you had to start again. So you would tend to check things very carefully. Later on, people got the idea of putting checksums in with these. So it wouldn't just crash. At least it would give you a clue as to where the problem was. So anyway, assembly language was great. It was very, very fast compared to BASIC. So once I got the Commodore 64 and I had lots of memory available, I started doing more with that. There was a package called PAL, which I think was called Personal Assembly Language, and that was by a guy called Brad Templeton, who, apropos nothing at all, ended up running Direct.Humor mailing list on the internet for quite a long time after his Commodore 64 stuff. But PAL was a fantastic assembler because it just let you write your programs as basic programs, only instead of basic statements, it was assembly. but you could use all the standard basic editor and line renumbering and all of that. And it would assemble stuff really, really quickly. And then you could try it out immediately and then go back and make a couple of edits. So PAL came with a disassembler as well. And so, of course, once you had the disassembler, you use the disassembler to disassemble PAL itself. And you can then start customizing PAL. So I ended up making quite a few changes to PAL to add things like macro assembly and so on. That I think maybe at that stage I was in college, so I was familiar with some of these from college projects. So yeah, lots of happy memories from then. What else did we do? At the time, some of you may remember that Commodore had made the 1541 disk drive. So for the first year or two of my life, it was all tape-based, and then I got a disk drive for my birthday, and this was, again, transformational.
Best thing in the world.
You know, instead of spending literally 45 minutes waiting for a program to load, it could load in maybe 1 to 2 minutes. Now, it should have been about 10 to 20 seconds, but Commodore made a serious hardware mistake in the implementation of the 1541, as I'm sure you are aware. And the only way to recover it without an expensive hardware redesign was to use a really slow serial interface and protocol to talk to the drive. So everybody suffered with that for a couple of years, and then some people figured out a way of downloading new firmware to the drive slowly. And then once you had the new firmware in the drive, you could quickly transfer stuff over to serial port using a faster protocol. So that started to become quite common, and I had to go doing that myself, and I developed a little fast loader. And its one claim to fame was that it was completely invisible. It took up 0 RAM on the Commodore 64. So that was a big thing, because as people became more and more familiar with it, they used to keep stealing memory from underneath the basic ROM and underneath the kernel ROM and various other places to try and get up to your full 64K of RAM. So the one place people usually didn't go near, at least not in the first few years, was underneath the character ROM, because you got to the character ROM if you swapped out the I/O space. But if you did another switch, you could swap out the character ROM and you'd have 4K of perfectly good RAM there. So I managed to stash my entire fast loader there. And what would happen, this is a long time ago, but as far as I can remember, I would steal about 128 bytes off the bottom of the stack, and I would use that to temporarily swap stuff in and out of normal RAM from that hidden space. So whenever you wanted to use the fast loader, it would swap itself into normal memory, do its magic, and then swap itself back out again. So for all intents and purposes, it didn't exist, and yet you still had the benefit of, you know, getting 10 or 20 times increase in speed. So that was pretty cool.
Very impressive.
And then there was a similar thing that we did on the tape loading, which I think was called UltraDOS, which worked much the same way, only it just sped up the tape loading. So your 45-minute program would now load in about 3 or 4 minutes off tape. And looking back at the technology that we had available then, it's amazing anything worked. It was extremely analog. But then again, if you look at modern computers, I think it's amazing they work as well. You know, there's so many things
so
that
much
could go
going
wrong.
on. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
So anyway, that got me firmly enmeshed in the world of Commodore, and there used to be Commodore conferences on in the Novotel in Hammersmith in the UK, and I got to go over to a few of those, and I would meet some of the Commodore celebrities, people like Jim Butterfield, and Andy Finkel was there one year, I think, who had done some of the original Commodore 64 demos in the user manual, and various other people. And, you know, great fun, met all kinds of interesting people there. And then the rumor starts to come around that Commodore were going to do like a much better computer with 32-bit and fancy graphics and da-da-da. So at that stage, my head was completely in Commodore, and I was following all the news, such as it was. It wasn't like you just log on to Twitter and see what the latest rumor is. But there was plenty of buzz around between the magazines and some of the bulletin boards as well. Long story short, I managed to get my hands on one of the early Amiga 1000s, and that's when things really took off. That was around about the time when I was going to college as well. So I was starting to learn about things like C programming and, you know, how to actually structure code and so on. And I also had the 6502 background, and the 68000 is very similar to the 6502 architecturally, just, you know, you've a bit more of everything essentially. So took me a little while to get up to speed on the Amiga, and then after a while managed to get a hard drive, and that was like when getting the 1541 for the Commodore 64 was just another huge jump forward.
Big leap, yeah.
And then other people in college had Amigas as well, and I was also getting involved in the online community. So a friend of mine had, in fact, a friend who bought the first Amiga 1000 in Ireland, which was an American model. He was always trying out things, and technically he was not particularly astute. He kind of knew his way around technology, but he wasn't a programmer or anything. But he loved to experiment, so he set up one of the first bulletin boards on the Amiga, and he then enrolled me to run it from. So that was a bulletin board called Informatique, and it became one of the main Amiga boards in Dublin for quite a few years. And we had a pretty large library of software, and we had some decent bulletin board software running on it, which we then customized. And that proved to be a great way to meet other Amiga people as well. I still run into people even now who were users back then and have good memories of it. So following on from that, then I started dabbling with software, and that was where Snoop DOS came from. Literally, I was just walking around college with a friend of mine who had just bought an Amiga, and he'd been trying to get some particular program working, and he was giving out about there were no error messages. It would just start and then stop, and there was no way to tell what was going on. And he said the computer should be able to tell me why it's not working. And it kind of planted the seed. So I went home that weekend and I thought, well, technically it should be able to. It just needs to keep track of the things it's likely to do. And then if one of those doesn't work, print a message about it. So I hacked together the first very early version of Snoop DOS, which was like 0.91 or something like that. And that was during the weekend, and I came in on Monday morning and I said to my friend Joe, give this a try. And he went off and tried it and came back and said, wow, it was missing a font. It is really handy.
There you go.
So, and yes, thus was Snoop DOS born. So I then spent about a year doing little refinements to it. If you remember, Fred Fish used to have pretty much a weekly disc of new public domain software.
Yeah.
So I sent a copy off to him fairly early on, and he started including it on several of his discs because it turned out to be quite a useful tool to try and get some of the other software on the discs working. So I started to hear feedback then from people around the world saying, this is very good, or can you make it do this, and so on. So I kept refining it and making little tweaks here and there. And over the course of about a year or two, I suppose it became quite popular. And then I was stationed over in America for a few months in early 1990. And I think that was around about, was it 1990? Maybe it was a bit later than that. Anyway, it was around about the time that OS 3.0 had just come out with all kinds of nice new features and so on. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn about all the new features. Let's do a rewrite of Snoop DOS and, make it all singing, all dancing, draggable columns and clipboard support and built-in Amiga help and resizable window and auto layout and blah, blah, blah. So it was really more a case of me just teaching myself about all these new technologies that I felt, I needed an excuse to learn. So I spent about maybe 2 or 3 months working on that and sent it out to a bunch of beta testers, and they all liked it. And I guess that became the version that they ran now. And the one thing that has really amazed me is after Commodore sort of went into the sunset around about 94, 95, the various PowerPC accelerator boards were starting to come out. And I started to get emails from people saying, it's not fully compatible with the PowerPC. And I'm like, no shit, there was no PowerPC when I wrote it.
Yeah.
And it runs at all. So similarly, I got a couple of reports saying the 68060 cache gives it a little bit of trouble. And again, well,
that wasn't around either, yeah.
Indeed. I'm very impressed it runs at all, given some of the things that it does. But what was nice is the people reporting this then went to the trouble of actually patching it and figuring out why it was broken and fixing it. So I then handed it off to a group of guys, because at that stage I had more or less moved on from the Amiga. So there was a group of guys who were quite active on the PowerPC, and they said, would you mind if we took it over? So I said, sure. Yeah, you have my blessing. Just keep a clear line as to, where your version kind of continues on, so people don't come bugging me if there's a problem with it. And they said, great, and off they went. So I'm not sure exactly what stage it's at now, but people still seem to be using it. So
absolutely, it's one of the first things I always install when I'm working on a new machine.
I use it on a daily basis. Trust me, it's very, very useful.
If you want to get help online, the first thing people are going to ask you is, what's the output of Snoop DOS?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so needless to say, when I started moving more towards on the PC, and especially in my professional life, I decided to go off and write a version of Snoop DOS for that. And I had already started, and I then came across Process Monitor and Registry Monitor by the sysinternals guys, and I was like, so they've had this idea too. Okay, now I don't need to bother. So that's one of my most used PC tools these days.
Yeah, handy one too.
And Eddy, did you write any other Amiga apps? I mean, after writing an app like that, you mightn't actually need to, but just curious.
So what I found when I started programming professionally for a living, it was a little bit of a culture shock, because after you spend the whole day programming and then you come home, you sort of are more or less ready to turn off. So I had been very active programming in all kinds of areas during college, and that didn't persist as much. I was doing lots of programming, just not in the open source and public domain world. Nevertheless, I did do a few other things that ended up being spread around a bit. I did a program called CPU Blit around about the time the Amiga 3000 came out, and that was because the 3000 had a 32-bit path to chip memory, and that meant it could access chip memory faster than the Blitter, because the Blitter was only 16-bit. So for certain types of graphics operations, it was actually faster to use the 68020 rather than the dedicated hardware. And again, it wasn't because the dedicated hardware was inefficient. It was purely because it only had a 16-bit path into memory instead of 32-bit path. So it was restricted by that. So the thing that used to really annoy me on the 3000 was when you were in a console window and you were doing the directory listing or whatever, and it was scrolling up, and you could actually see the text scrolling up the screen, kind of nearly one line at a time. Really frustrating. You just wanted it to be faster. So I optimized around that, and I came up with a couple of tricks to make that run quite quickly. And I also made it fairly good at not getting in the way of other things where it could cause problems. And it was only a tiny little program, but it did what it did quite well. And again, people seemed to like it, and it ended up getting spread around quite a few places. And then there was an English service called CompuNet, which real old-timers may remember. This was kind of like an English version of an American service called Q-Link. And it was also like a Commodore version of Prestel or Micronet. And essentially you could buy a modem from Commodore, plug it into the modem port on your Commodore 64. All the modem software was built into the cartridge, as well as the modem hardware. And it had a very nice GUI on it, in as much as, at 40 by 25 character resolution, you can do a GUI. But it had scrolling menus, and it was called the duck shoot menu, where you could scroll horizontally to select options. You could upload software. They actually had an online marketplace where you could write your own software, upload it, set a price for it, and CompuNet would do a 50-50 share with you. So they would host it and distribute it for 50%, and then the other 50% of any revenue went against your CompuNet account. And if you were really lucky, sometimes that ended up being a net positive. However, CompuNet was quite expensive to use, so usually you were doing okay if you broke even. CompuNet also had the first multi-user game, which was the original MUD, which started in Essex University in 78, 79. And they did a custom version of it specifically to run on CompuNet, which ran on DEC 20 mainframes really. A modern iPhone would run rings around it now, but at the time they were pretty decent mainframes. And you could use CompuNet to play MUD. And this was one of the really early multi-user games where you could be playing up to 20 other people, all sitting at their Commodore 64s in London, Edinburgh, Wales, Dublin, wherever, Greystones in my case. So when the Amiga came along, CompuNet moved onto the Amiga as well. But there was a big problem, and the problem was CompuNet ran at 1275. So there was 1200 baud download, 75 baud upload. Now, very like the modern DSL modems where your download is faster than your upload. 75 baud is, if you're a good typist, you can easily out-type 75 baud. It's really not very fast. But CompuNet was mostly about downloading. It was only sending keystrokes and things up. So it was actually okay. The problem was that the Commodore 64 hardware that was built into the modem was optimized for doing 1275. On the Amiga, the serial hardware couldn't do 1275, so you had to either get a very expensive smart 1200 modem that had a 1275 fallback in its firmware, and they were at the time €500-600. There were things like the US Robotics Courier and so on. You couldn't just go out and get a cheap modem. In particular, you couldn't go out and get a cheap £70 or £80 1275 modem, such as you would use with a BBC Micro or something else. So I was very disgruntled by this. So I managed to do a serial driver for the Amiga, which would talk at 1200, but for the upload part, it would emulate 75 baud by sending 16 characters at 1200 baud in, just the right pattern to fool the modem hardware into thinking that it was 75 baud. And if you know much about serial encoding, it's not quite as straightforward as that, because you have start and stop bits. And those start and stop bits you generally don't have any control over at the hardware level. That the hardware puts them in automatically. So I tried a naive approach to it first, just ignoring that, and it just didn't work at all. And I then found I could do the equivalent of kind of signal smoothing. So if there were any little ripples caused by 010 transitions, I could just smooth them out and essentially then rely on the clock skew correction that was built into the modem hardware to kind of fix all of that. And amazingly, it actually worked. So CompuNet then started distributing that to all their Amiga customers, and it probably helped. Well, I have no idea how much it helped, but it certainly opened it up to a wider audience of Amiga users, because now you could buy a cheap modem for £60-70 instead of an expensive one for several £100s. So that was good fun, and that introduced me to guys like Dave Parkinson, who was quite active on the UK Amiga scene for a while, and that also got me lots of kudos at the Amiga DevCons that I used to go to. So what else did I do? There was some bulletin board software that I did that was quite niche, and a few other little bits and pieces. I did a thing called OnShare, which back in the days of the internet news groups, if you remember, programs would be UU encoded, and they would be posted as text messages, and sometimes multi-part text messages if it was a big enough piece of software, because there was a limit of maybe 30 or 40k on the size of an individual message. So if you had several 100k, you would have to concatenate them all. And it was quite painstaking to strip all of this stuff out. So I did a kind of an archive tool that would just figure all that out for you. You would just throw all the messages at it. It would put them in the right order based on the subject line, figure out the format, extract them all. Usually they were packaged as some kind of shell script, and then you run the shell script to split it back into its original file. So it would do all of that. And again, it was nice and small, so you could just include it on every disk or zip file or whatever that you were distributing. So that got a reasonable amount of distribution as well. There's probably other stuff as well, but my memory isn't that good anymore. We feel very old.
Oh dear. So I think we mentioned it earlier, but you're not really involved with the Amiga community anymore, are you? Or do you have any involvement at all?
So I don't have any ongoing involvement at the moment. Other than that, I'm still kind of very interested in Amiga history and Commodore history.
Yeah.
I was saying earlier, just looking around the Amiga users website, I was very impressed by how much stuff is actually going on. If you had asked me before I looked at that, I would have said there's very little going on.
Yeah.
But actually, if you go out and look, things like AROS and OS4 and a whole load of things, which I think is fantastic and is actually, is encouraging me now to go out and look at this in more detail. My biggest problem these days is I have essentially zero spare time because I have two kids that are occupying nearly all of my time. And my day job is pretty intense at the moment as well. But I would love to get back more involved in that because I have so many happy memories from the 90s and the 80s when all of this stuff was new. So it's great to see that it has survived this long, and in fact not only survived but it appears to be thriving.
Well, I was just about to say that it's in the last few years it's kind of picked up, because I think sort of around 2004, 2005 is probably the lowest point that I remember, and I remember kind of picking up a couple of 1200s for basically nothing. People were just giving them away and giving away the hardware, and no one wanted anything to do with it. So but since then it's been on the up, it seems. And if you look on eBay, as soon as any reasonable condition Amiga comes up, it's snapped up, or it goes for crazy money sometimes. There's actually quite a demand for it, and there's a lot of this new user groups cropping up and new hardware coming out, and so it's definitely on the up at the moment.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned in the previous podcast that there's been a huge renaissance in terms of what you might call DIY hardware. And the tools that are out there and the capabilities for someone who has a little bit of hardware sort of interest and expertise to just sit at home and develop FPGA based stuff, their own circuit board. With 3D printing you can do decent cases now as well for not much money.
Yeah, that's it.
It's stuff that 10 years ago was literally the stuff of science fiction. So that's fabulous as well, and it opens up all kinds of new possibilities. One of the most impressive things I've seen recently, which is not directly related to Commodore but it's indirectly very related, is a website called Visual 6502. Have you come across that?
No, I haven't, but I'd like the sound of it.
It's well worth a look. What essentially happened was somebody in, I believe, Hungary got access to an electron microscope, scanning microscope, and they took an old 6502 processor and they got some acid and they started burning the layers off, with one layer at a time, and using the electron microscope to essentially photograph it at very, very high resolution. And what they got was a series of pictures of the transistors that make up the 6502. And they then developed some software which could digitize those transistors from the photograph and do a logical map of transistors. They then wrote a simulator to simulate those transistors, and having done that, they ended up with an exact simulation, not an emulation, but an actual simulation of the 6502. Now,
at transistor level.
At transistor level. Wow. So what's the difference between an emulation and the simulation? The simulation was doing essentially what the real hardware was doing. So all the undocumented instructions, all the quirks, all the weirdness is exactly reproduced. So not content with that, they then re-implemented the simulator in JavaScript. And if you go to visual6502.org on your iPhone or Android, you can actually run the 6502 emulator in JavaScript on your phone, and it has a nice visual screen that shows you the entire chip, and it flashes to different portions of the chip as instructions are executing.
Brilliant.
And it shows you 0 page, and you can see all the memory being modified in real time. And it just blows my mind. And the total time that was taken to develop this was about 6 weeks, including all the scanning and so on. So I just take my hat off to them. It's impressive stuff. And that's just one example. There was a talk, I think it might have been at one of the Chaos Computer Club kind of meetups, a few years ago, maybe 2012, and I just came across it on YouTube the other day, and it was an analysis of a Commodore 64 demo, and it was one of the kind of later generation demos that was, pulling out all the stops, and it actually went through it step by step, talking about all the assembly language tricks that they had used to achieve various things. And again, it was highly detailed, highly impressive, just fabulous. Had any of this stuff been available when these platforms originally came out, it just blows your mind as to what could have been achieved.
What might have happened, yeah, absolutely.
So, so we live in wondrous times, for sure.
Absolutely.
If you could tell us, what do you do for a living these days?
So, it's at the moment it's a straightforward question. A few years ago, it wasn't quite so straightforward. So I'll give you a tiny bit of history.
Okay, please do.
Go for it.
So came out of college in 1990, having done 4 years of computer science, and 4 years of Amiga stuff on the side. And there was very little happening on the computer scene in Ireland at that stage, or certainly that I could see. And most of my class ended up moving abroad for their first job. But I didn't particularly want to move abroad because I enjoyed Ireland and I liked living here and all my family were here. So I interviewed with two companies. One was a graphics company that made graphics hardware, and one was a communications company. And there was a thing called ASN1, which if you've ever had any involvement in telecommunications, I sincerely hope you've not come across it. Abstract Syntax Notation version 1.
Gosh.
It's a very detailed way of specifying protocols and storage formats and so on. And I had done one of my final year projects on ASN1, and I just tasted it with a vengeance. So the communications company during the interview said, "Oh, we see you did ASN1 for one of your projects. That's really useful. That'll come in really handy here." So I said, "Right, thanks very much." And I went off and joined the graphics company. And that turned out to be a great place to work. They had a development office in Dunleary in South Dublin, and they were just starting to introduce a new range of high-end graphics accelerators based on the Texas Instruments 34020 microprocessor. And this was very similar architecturally and in other ways to the Amiga Plus splitter. It had two cores, and one was essentially a MIPS processor, or something very similar to a MIPS processor, but the instruction set was very like the 68000. And then the other core had built-in primitives for doing all the stuff that the Amiga Blitter did, which I already knew very well. So this processor sat on a separate graphics card inside your PC. It had its own video connector, and you could connect up a high-resolution screen at sort of 1280 by 1024, which, was pretty high resolution back in 1990.
Yeah.
Certainly the monitors that could display that were about $3,000 each. But you had to have a separate monitor for your VGA display, because the idea of multi-mode hadn't really come about yet. So I got to spend the first year in that job writing drivers and assembly language and control software and so on to talk to that graphics card, which was fabulous. And then I got sent over to the States to work on the graphics coprocessor for that card, which was a floating point chip that could do all kinds of 3D stuff very efficiently. And that was even better. So we had things like AutoCAD, and there was a standard AutoCAD test image of the space shuttle, and it was a very detailed representation of the space shuttle in wireframe. And it would take about 150 seconds to render using the normal AutoCAD VGA driver, which is literally just how long it would take to draw this model on the screen at full zoom out with all the vertices and so on. And with our driver, using the 3D acceleration and so on, it was about 0.6 seconds. So that was a pretty good improvement if you're working with that kind of stuff on a day-to-day basis in an engineering company or something. So anyway, this was like my dream job, having come off the back of the Amiga, and it took me over to the States for a number of months every year, and got to work with all kinds of cool people, really strong hardware developers. We were involved in the race for one of the first 3D graphics chips. And if you remember Creative Labs and the 3DFX, around about that era, there were actually about 23 different graphics companies, all vying to be the standard 3D graphics chip. And at one stage, both Dell and Gateway were tendering for a 3D graphics chip to go on their motherboard. And that was kind of like the nirvana. If you got that deal now, you were made. So we got down to the last 3. We developed our own 3D chip at that stage, and we got down to the last 3 out of about 20 companies that were vying for us. And sadly, we didn't get it. S3 beat us out on price rather than on features. And the company had put an awful lot of money into that effort. And after it didn't pay off, the company slowly went downhill over the next 2 years. So when I joined, I think there had been about 200 people altogether. And by the time I left in 1998, I think there were 5 of us left. So at that stage, I decided, I think I see where this is going. I don't think it's going to turn around. So I decided it was time to do something else. So I then joined a company that made network routers. And at that stage, I had just gotten an ISDN line as an improvement over the standard phone line, because you could do 64K or potentially 128 kilobits a second if you bonded 2 channels together. And I was very conscious of the fact that ISDN was billed by the minute. And I didn't like the idea that you could have your line sitting up there ticking away, costing you money inadvertently. So I was quite keen to find a modem that, could dynamically dial only when there was data going backwards and forwards, and wouldn't keep the line up the whole time costing money, and could be intelligent about it. And so I started looking around, and I couldn't really find a router that did exactly what I wanted. And a friend of mine from college was working for this company, and I was chatting to him, and he said, well, our routers nearly do that. And by the way, we're hiring. So I went along and interviewed there, and ended up joining them, and ended up making a few changes to their software to make my ISDN line work just the way I wanted. And I stayed there for probably about 6 years. And in the meantime, we developed an ADSL router, one of the first ADSL routers. And I was fairly intensively involved in that. The original ISDN router was based on an embedded 386 processor. And then we moved over to PowerPC for doing the DSL stuff. And then in 2004, I decided it was time for something else. So I went off and did consulting for a few years. And then a couple of friends that I had been experimenting with speech recognition. And, in fact, one friend in particular liked his cars, and he liked his technology. And he was an ex-Intel guy. And he was pretty hardware savvy and software savvy. So he had designed a mobile MP3 system that was voice controlled, where all the electronics lived in the car booth, and then he had a kind of a microphone up in the cockpit that relayed stuff back by radio and all of this. And he had his whole MP3 collection sitting in the booth, and he could just call out songs as he was driving along. And we were like, this is really cool. You could definitely productize this. And long story short, we ended up forming a company, and the technology evolved into a living room solution. And we developed a remote control that worked with Windows Media Center and speech recognition software that would give you access to all your various types of media, be it, MP3 songs or videos or DVDs that you might have ripped, or your TV guide, all of that. That was all based at that stage on Windows and C#, and then there was some embedded code in the remote control itself. So it was one of those products where everybody who had it seemed to love it, but we were very bad at getting it into people's hands. So that ran for about 5 years, and we ran out of money and customers. And then I was back into the world of consulting again, and I actually ended up back where I started, more or less, with the communications company, where I've been more or less full-time for the last 2 years. Only instead of doing ADSL, we're now doing VDSL. And instead of running our own operating system, we're now running OpenWRT, which is a version of Linux specifically geared at router applications. So that's basically what's keeping me busy these days, and it's actually keeping me very busy. It's not very exciting, but it is very interesting.
Absolutely. It sure is. And there are some interesting hardware developments going on at the moment for Amiga. Do you have opinions on it? Things like the Vampire accelerator cards and the new Amiga, the motherboards, the PPC ones that are coming out under AEON and stuff like that.
So I don't have a huge opinion on them because I'm only vaguely aware of them. But I'm absolutely enthusiastic about them to the point where, you know, I would seriously think about getting one myself, if for no reason other than just to dip my feet back into that world again. You know, and as I was saying earlier, I think it's a real testament to the strength of the platform itself that here we are 20, 25, even 30 years on, and there's still so much enthusiasm and so much interest in it. You know, at the time, it's hard to really imagine how popular things like the Commodore 64 and then the Amiga were in their time. The Commodore 64, I think worldwide sales were 18 or 19 million. Even by today's standards, you know, that's a huge user base for any desktop platform.
For one single machine. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Commodore got an awful lot of things wrong, but they also got an awful lot of things right. And a lot of that came down to having a really strong engineering team behind them. And, you know, had the rest of their team match the capabilities of the engineering team, you know, we could be having a very different conversation at the moment. I noticed David Pleasance's project, which is in progress at the moment, which would be kind of like the inside story of Commodore from his perspective over in the UK. So I'm very much looking forward to reading that, to finding out a little bit more about what may have gone on behind the scenes that we're not always privy to. Yeah,
I'd say it'll be a good read, all right. Yeah. So for I suppose the same goes for the new incarnations of the operating system itself. You know, have you had any experience at all with like the likes of AROS and MorphOS and OS4, or is it, you know, you're just hearing about it again now?
Pretty much just hearing about it now, but in particular AROS, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is essentially a re-implementation of the Amiga API as an emulation API running on other platforms. I think it's a fabulous idea. It is, I guess, similar to Wine for Windows emulation on Linux.
It's actually sort of a native implementation as well. So there is a version that runs hosted on Linux, but there's a native actually running on the hardware version as well.
Sure. And as I understand it, there is a version that will run native binaries on PowerPC or 68K hardware as well. It
seems to be quite easy to compile it for different architectures, which is impressive.
Yeah, I think fabulous. A huge undertaking, given that a lot of the documentation for the internals of the OS stuff was somewhat limited. The Amiga documentation in general was quite good. But there were still quite a lot of unknowns that you would need to figure out for a project like that. And from the quick reads I had before coming on today, it sounds like they're pretty much at the 100% stage now.
Well, it's perfectly usable as an operating system in as much as an Amiga style operating system can be. But yes, it's perfectly usable. One of the key AROS developers is an Irish guy as well.
Really?
Down in Cork. And is he lecturing or something in UCC?
Yeah, he is.
Computer scientist or something along those lines.
Neil.
Yeah.
Excellent. I see. We Irish guys, we're all over the place now.
Absolutely.
Right. If we could ask you about a favorite game, app, and maybe a demo as well.
Sure. This is going to be quite old school.
Okay, go on.
So, favorite game. Probably the game that impressed me most at the time was the Psygnosis game. I think it was Shadow of the Beast. I remember when I saw that originally, literally my jaw was just on the floor. You know, it was one of the most impressive things I had seen up until that point.
Absolutely.
As an actual game, it was okay, but visually, it was just stunning.
Yeah, technically, it's brilliant. Yeah.
In terms of games that I really enjoyed playing, there were two games that stick out. One was Great Cabana Sisters, which was not overly groundbreaking in any particular way, but they just absolutely nailed all the important stuff from my perspective. So many happy hours of playing that. Really enjoyed it. And then the other game, which is not a million miles away from us, was Boulder Dash and also Lemmings. So you can see I'm kind of more into the puzzle games than the shoot 'em ups. Wasted far too much time in all of those games over the years, and revisited some of them actually only a couple of years ago, they still had it. In terms of apps, Deluxe Paint is like one of the original apps that got an awful lot of use. I used Deluxe Paint for loads and loads of things. Really, really nice app to start off with, because, and again, if you look at it now, it would look extremely crude. It'd be like painting with crayons. But at the time, when you look at where everything else was, and then Deluxe Paint came along, it was such a jump forward that, you could feel your mind expanding with the possibilities. So that was great. There were some other apps as well. I'm trying to remember now. There was another graphics program called Photogenic, which was actually by Jolyon Ralph, who I'm still in touch with quite regularly, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Very good guy. And that had a couple of rough edges, but it had a really nice plug-in architecture, and some of the plugins were fabulous for it, and you could do some really nice things with that. Lightwave, I played with a bit as well, and that was deeply impressive, but you had to know what you were doing to get the best out of it. And sadly, I didn't really know what I was doing.
It didn't stop you wasting many hours faffing about with cylinders and spheres. Well, for me, anyway. Many winter's evenings spent just rendering random shapes.
Yeah, exactly. So beyond that, there's probably plenty of others, but they've kind of faded from my memory. Well, I will give one small shout out. They're not really apps as such, but the debug tools Enforcer and Mungwall in particular were just so useful. And they were so useful to the point that I ended up re-implementing them both on the PC and then on the various embedded platforms that I've worked on professionally since then. And in fact, the most recent one was as recently as a week ago for a particular bug I was trying to track down on our current platform. Just tremendously useful tools. And again, at the time, that kind of stuff is fairly commonly available now, but at the time it wasn't. And it's a testament to the engineering strength of Commodore's development team. They really knew their stuff. In terms of demos, I used to crave the latest demos, and I would get them from wherever I could. So I should be able to rattle off 10 demos off the top of my head, but I can't because it's so long ago. However, I do remember State of the Art, which pretty much lived up to its name. That was really impressive. Most things by Red Sector, in the same way that certain authors, if they have a new book out, you will just tend to buy it because it's by that author. And similarly with Red Sector, any Red Sector demo that I came across, I just knew it was going to be a good one. In a slightly different direction, the original Amiga Juggler demo, which went back to 1985 or 1986, completely blew me away when I saw it as well. And again, very crude by the standards of even a couple of years later. But at the time, that was I think one of the first programs to use the 496 color ham mode. So instead of being limited to 16 colors or even 256 colors, here was all this really subtle shading on spheres, and as they were moving around the screen, you could see the reflections in them, and it was like, oh my god. Now I have to say, I probably had most, if not all, of my family driven demented back when we were living in Greystones, because they would routinely be dragged into the computer room to see whatever demo I had managed to get my hands on, and they would have to sit there for 3 minutes and pretend they were enjoying it. So I have to give a shout out to them for their infinite patience.
Good stuff.
But yeah, lots of happy memories of both the Commodore 64 and the Amiga demos.
And there were some, like, one of the things I remember are the magazines that brought the latest and greatest news and surprises every month or however often they were. Did you read any of those magazines?
Indeed, I read pretty much all of them that I could get my hands on. Things like Amiga Format, Computer Shopper, which was quite a general one, was it actually had really good articles. One thing that used to annoy me greatly was computer magazines that had articles written by people who didn't know what they were writing about, which was unfortunately more common than it should have been. But the result of that was when you came across articles written by people who did know what they were writing about, that was tremendously refreshing. So Computer Shopper looked like it should have been a really tacky magazine, and in some ways it was, but actually a lot of the stuff that was in there was really good, solid technical stuff, so I enjoyed that. There was a magazine called Transactor from Canada, which actually started off as the Toronto Pet Users Group magazine, but it turned into a full magazine that had tremendously good technical information in it. Then there was a guy called Jeff Walker, and he had an Amiga magazine that I did some writing for as well, and that was really good. In fact, it's probably the only magazine that I still have in my attic. I'm in my attic office at the moment, and I believe if I was to open one of those cupboard doors and have a look through it, I would actually find all my old issues of Jeff Walker's magazine. That used to do real kind of deep dives into various things, desktop publishing, ray tracing, programming, and so on. In a way that other magazines wouldn't take the risk with. So that was good. I came across through a link on the Amiga users website actually, the archives of Amazing Amiga, which was one of the American magazines, and for a good number of years that was also a must-read. It just covered a slightly different slant on the Amiga scene than most of the UK magazines. So they would have interviews with people that you would never come across in Europe, and interesting people doing interesting things with their Amigas. So that was good fun as well. And plenty of other ones, Zap 64 back in the day, and what do we call this? Something video games back in the early 80s. Computer and video games.
Computer and video games, yeah.
That's the one, yes. Many happy memories of that one as well. So, there was the UK in particular had a great computer scene for quite a while. And it's kind of interesting. You still see some of those old authors popping up from time to time.
Absolutely,
in other parts of the world, and they're still doing what they were doing, albeit in maybe a slightly different guise. So, yeah.
And what about there've been a couple of books. Well, there was a book a while ago about the rise and fall of Commodore. I think was the subtitle. It was On the Edge. Did you have a read of that?
I have it here somewhere. Actually, I think I did read it. I'm trying to remember. Did it arrive and I read it, or did I try to order it and I couldn't find somewhere to order it? But I'm pretty sure that I have it here somewhere. And if I do, then I read it and enjoyed it. That sounds frighteningly vague. I, to be honest, I have a bit of a soft spot for nearly any computer history book. So if I just turn around and look at my bookshelves behind me here, there's about, I don't know, probably 200 or 300 computer books on there, and the vast majority are some variation of computer history. Which is
always fascinating.
Always fascinating. Not a great use of space, to be honest.
No.
Again, I can't get rid of any.
That's one that I have myself, and I've read it a couple of times. And that particular one. There's no way to get rid of it.
Yeah. But, in terms of other books, there are a few books I really rate. There was one called the Amiga Guru book, which you possibly came across.
Yeah.
It was by Ralph Babel.
Something like that.
A real technical deep dive into all of the sort of technical internals of the Amiga. Highly recommended for anyone who wants to do serious Amiga programming. Yeah, Ralph Babel. Then there was a real slim little book by Mike Sins, and I think it was called something like Guru Meditation Volume 1. Now, Mike Sins is the guy who actually wrote the exact kernel originally, and a very smart guy. He also wrote Enforcer that we mentioned earlier, and various other cool things. Very, very high class guy. And this is a real slim book, but it talks all about the internals of exec and how to use it to its best advantage. And then there was another book called, I think, Inside Amiga DOS. And again, if you know your Amiga history, you'll recall that Amiga DOS was developed by a UK company as a kind of a bolt-on, because the original Amiga disk operating layer wasn't ready in time, and there was an issue, and so they just got this English company to port something else, which became Amiga DOS, and it had all the BCPL structures and
headers are a nightmare and all that.
Yeah, it was a very uneasy match, and B pointers that were shifted left twice, and it was.
It's still a pain in the hole.
It was not a perfect fit, but Amiga DOS Internals was the first book that really kind of shone a light on a lot of those decisions from a technical point of view, and why certain things are the way they are, and how to get the best use out of them, and so on. And it had a really good covering of the DOS API as well, to a level of detail that hadn't been covered anywhere else. I sort of have a recollection that there was a book that had a full disassembly of exec with comments. I don't know if I'm imagining that or not.
Not what I have anyway.
Yeah. If there was, I'm going to put that in the list as well. If there wasn't, then there definitely should be. I certainly had a Commodore 64 version, which was by a Danish publisher, I think, and it came in a ring-bound binder, and it was a full disassembly of the Commodore 64 basic and kernel, with full annotation explaining all the tricks and why things were done. Tremendously useful.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And in fact, on the strength of that, a couple of us, because I was still in school when I got that, so a couple of us printed out the PET ROM and did the same exercise on the PET ROM, just because you can.
Yeah, and you have that much free time.
Indeed, yeah. God, I remember those days having free time.
Yeah.
So all that kind of stuff I find fascinating.
Right. Can you tell us, do you still own any Amiga hardware?
So the Amigas that I own at the moment, I have an Amiga. I have my original Amiga 1000 with all the signatures under the lid, and I have my friend's Amiga 1000, which is the NTSC version.
Very nice.
I think I might still have my Amiga 4000 actually. I was trying to remember, did that end up getting sold? But I have a feeling that I wasn't able to let go of it. And then I have a couple of old Amiga SCSI disk drives, and I think my 4000 has a TCP/IP card in it as well for getting online. But I also think that it may have been using coax rather than twisted pair. So the number of things I could connect it to is probably diminishingly small at this stage.
Yeah. Wow.
So that would be probably it for the Amigas. On the Commodore 64 side, I still got my VIC, my Commodore 64, my Commodore 128, and I think I might have a C16 kicking around somewhere as well, and possibly even a CD32. I never had a 1200, but only because I couldn't justify it. But I always really raised the 1200. The 1200 to me was, after the 3000, it was the next sort of near perfect computer that Commodore had done. It just ticked all the boxes. And I remember before the 1200 came out, I was reading a lot of the rumor about what it was going to have and what it wasn't going to have, and some of the ways they may cripple it so it doesn't compete too closely with the 4000. And in the end, they brought it out, and from my perspective, they've made all the right decisions. They have made it genuinely good, rather than something that could have been great but wasn't.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Well, I didn't end up getting one myself. I knew loads of people that did, and it was probably my second favorite Amiga actually after the 3000.
And still it's like one of the most popular ones nowadays as well,
and rightly so.
Yeah, that's it. Just a little word on the 4000. If you do still have it, I would pull it out and make sure it doesn't still have its battery in it, because I've had to repair a few of them now over the last while. That the battery leaked on the motherboard and destroyed it.
That is an excellent point. I will check that.
Put that out there.
I will check that the next time I'm in Greystones.
Check capacitors as well next to audio.
Yeah. Believe it or not, the capacitors start to leak at this age as well, and only on the 4000s. Your older ones are probably fine. But
I was going to
4000 and 1200s. Yeah.
I was going to say, actually, there's a certain vintage that if you're older than, you're probably fine on the capacitors.
Yeah.
It was when capacitor manufacturing started kind of ramping up and people started cutting corners and so on. In terms of suppliers, that the problem started. We had the same issue on some of our early routers. Sadly, very sadly, in terms of what it cost to put right.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. It's unfortunate, but yeah, worth keeping an eye on if you
absolutely
if you want to keep it running.
Absolutely. So.
So the CUGI meetings back in the day, so they were a fairly formal affair, were they, or what way was it run?
They were pretty informal. The way they worked generally was we met every fortnight. I think the annual membership was maybe about £15 or £20, something like that. It was relatively nominal, and the club had a library of software, a public domain software, and anyone was welcome to take any of us, or if they just brought along a blank disk, they could get a copy of us, of any software they wanted from us any evening. The way the evenings were structured, it would generally run from 7 until maybe around 9:30, 10, depending on what was going on. There would usually be 2 or 3 kind of semi-formal presentations. We met in one of the local schools, so we had access to the school's video projector, which was an absolutely massive thing that had to be transported down the entire, from one side of the school to the other, down various corridors and up and down minor hills on this kind of rickety flooring with bumps in it. I don't know to this day why. I suppose it was non-slip maybe, but the wheels on the trolley for this really expensive projector were very small, and every single bump made it vibrate. And how we didn't blow the bulb out, I don't know, but we never did. So we had this big sort of equivalent of, I suppose, 6 foot by 4 foot screen to actually project the Amiga onto, which was fantastic. So we would generally have 2 or 3 people will give sort of 10 or 15 minute presentation on some particular aspect. It might be a new piece of software they had, they would demonstrate, or a demo or a game, or they would show you how to do a programming thing or things of that nature. Some people would just do a general talk about something that has happened to them. I remember actually I was talking about speech recognition earlier. One of the very early Amiga speech recognition products, and I can't even remember who did it, but I had bought it and I decided I would give a demonstration of it. So this would have been around maybe 1987 time frame. So as if you know anything about speech recognition, it's quite processor intensive to do all the algorithms to do good quality speech recognition. Safe to say it's comfortably beyond what a 68,000 running at 7 megahertz can do a good job on, but never let it be said it didn't try. So I started off doing the demo, and the way it would work is you could train it with various phrases, and it would then recognize those phrases, and you could trigger actions based off them. So I had a few kind of pot phrases set up and canned responses through the Amiga speech synthesizer and so on. So started off and did the first one, and there was some noise from the audience, and then the microphone picked up that noise and did its best to match against it. And of course it didn't do it very well, because it was just doing random matching at that stage, and that made the audience laugh harder, which then matched against something else, and the demo just went on completely lights out like that for about 10 minutes of the audience laughing, and then it saying something random and then them laughing at that. So that was quite entertaining. But we had a number of firsts at the meetings. We were the first, certainly in Ireland, possibly in the UK in some cases, to show off a number of the new bits of Commodore hardware, like the CD32, the Amiga 4000, the Amiga 3000, and so on. So it was a great opportunity for people to get their hands on this stuff and actually try it out. Because at the time, a lot of those machines were still quite expensive to go out and buy. Like €1,000 or £1,000 back then was, pretty hefty chunk of cash. It's a pretty hefty chunk of cash now, but 20 years ago it was quite serious money. So we had a few brave souls in the club that had budget to spend on this, and we're quite happy to let people kick the tires. So at our peak, we probably had about 50 people coming to the meetings every fortnight, and there was a committee of about 5 or 6 people who would meet a week in advance and just figure out who was going to be browbeaten into presenting something the following Friday. And I think there was a club newsletter as well that came out once a month, which would be anywhere up to 20 or 30 pages. And again, we would have an editor that would go around and hit people on the head until they produced an article that could be included in the newsletter. So all those newsletters are still on file somewhere as well. Mm-hmm. So, but certainly some of the friendship. Indeed. I think the website is probably still online with at least some of that content. I think it's probably cugi.org, cugi.org. I would imagine it's very much of its time. I haven't been there for a few years. But if you want to see what things were like back then, it'll maybe give a little bit of a sense of it. So some of the friendships that were formed back then, or last true to that day. I'm going out tomorrow night now with 3 or 4 guys who I met there in probably the mid '80s, and we're still in touch, and we still meet up every month or two. So happy times.
Right, Eddie, did you ever expect Snoop DOS to be as popular as it became?
Honestly, no. I was very surprised, to be honest, by how far afield it travelled. From my point of view, I was sitting in a bedroom in Dublin typing away, or in Greystones, I think, as it was then, and I just sent off some of this stuff on the internet or by email to some of the news groups, and then didn't really think much more about it. And then you start getting contacts from California, from Switzerland, from Germany, Australia in one case, Italy. So it really kind of opened my horizons in a sense that there was such a widespread community out there willing to engage. And it became a great calling card as well if I was traveling myself later on, in that most people that I ran into who were familiar with the Amiga had also come across Snoop DOS at some point. So I certainly didn't set out with the intent that it would be that popular, but very nice that that's the way it turned out.
Did you ever put it on your CV?
I think it may still be on my CV because I registered the domain for Snoop DOS back in the early days when domain name registration was quite easily available. And I ended up calling my consulting company after it. And it turned out to be a really bad idea because anytime I'm calling out the name over the phone to somebody, they're always like, "Oh, Snoop Dogg." And I'm like, "No, not Snoop Dogg." And in fact, if you look up Snoop Dogg, he actually came after Snoop DOS. He came
Yeah.
So, take that, Snoop Dogg. But it's caused so much grief in that way that if I was doing it all again, I just would have done something different. But I still have the domain name, and it's still my main email address. So it's in as much as I have an up-to-date CV, which I don't, but if I did, it would be on there in that form, certainly. And I still have the Snoop DOS tribute page buried somewhere on one of my old websites. So I'm sure Google has it all indexed. Actually, I'm pretty sure Google doesn't, for complicated reasons relating to the takeover of Ireland Online by ESAT, and ESAT breaking something on their web server, which serves up a "don't index anything on this site" to Google. So it may be a little bit more obscure than it should be. But I'm sure if you really want to find it and dig around, you'll eventually come across it.
I'm sure it's around somewhere, all right.
Yeah, probably one of the things I did with Snoop DOS, which I'm fairly happy I did, was to make the source code available with it. And I've had plenty of positive feedback from that as well. And to that end, I suppose certainly for Snoop DOS 3, I was a bit more conscientious when I was writing it, that it may have a slightly wider audience than just myself in terms of people reading the source code. So I probably put a bit more effort into structuring it and making sure it was well commented and so on. And my hope was that, if somebody wanted to come along and see an example of, how do you make a window react to resizing and relay out all the gadgets and so on. How do you do that? Well, here's one way to do it, that could actually be followed.
Absolutely. It's I've always noticed that myself as well, that you always write code differently if you're writing for someone else.
For sure, yeah. It's a bit like getting dressed before you go outdoors.
Yeah,
you want to put your best foot forward.
Absolutely. So, and just on that as well, I noticed there are clones of Snoop DOS as well. Just as an aside, because I know I have an OS4 machine here as well, and it's got Snoopy on it.
I was going to say Snoopy came along a little bit after, and it did some things a little bit differently than I would have done them. But sure, that's all part.
It works.
That's all
works
part
very, very well, and that's
exactly.
It wouldn't exist without you.
Well, exactly. If everybody did everything the same, life would be extremely boring.
Well, absolutely.
And often, no matter how good you think you've done something, when somebody else comes along and puts their perspective on it, you see an angle that you weren't previously aware of, and you go, God, can't believe I didn't think of that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, absolutely, the more the merrier.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think you'll come back to the fold at some stage and get another Amiga in semi-regular use?
I would like to say no, but I can't guarantee. I can't guarantee it, because now you've kind of whetted my appetite with all this stuff, AROS, 4, and so on, and new hardware and so on. It's very tempting. It's very tempting. I have no bandwidth whatsoever, but that hasn't really stopped me in the past. So we'll wait and see. No guarantees. But if you'd asked me, 10, 15 years ago, would people even know what an Amiga was in 2017? I would have been very skeptical, and
not at all,
and here we are. So, who knows?
You'll have to come along to the next Ireland meeting anyway, in January, and have a look at what's going on.
Well, indeed, I very much look forward to that, and hopefully I'm going to be in the country. And if I am, I will certainly do my best to make it down there, because Athlone is only about an hour away. So very, very reachable. And in fact, it's great you're having it in such a country central location. Because things tend to happen too much in Dublin sometimes, and it's great for all of us in Dublin, but for everyone around the rest of the country, it's the onus is on them to try and get there. So Athlone is a good central location, and there's lots of other nice stuff in Athlone to make a weekend out of it as well.
Absolutely.
Right. Is there any chance, in your opinion, that somehow, someday, Amiga can go mainstream again, like in the 80s or in the 90s?
I think, being honest about it, no. highly unlikely. But also, I think if it did go mainstream, it would probably end up losing elements of what make it uniquely Amiga. In order to go mainstream, you would have to get the vast majority of computer users to adapt to it, and that's really not going to happen. So if that was the goal, you would have to change it so much that it would no longer be an Amiga. It would just be something else that was, some kind of diluted version of what we already have on Windows or whatever. So I don't really see it happening, but I also don't see it as desirable that happen. I think it's great that all the people that are involved in this at the moment are involved because of their enthusiasm for it, not because they just needed to achieve a goal and that's all. So long live enthusiasm.
On the subject of enthusiasm, what are your best memories of Amiga personally?
Probably some of my fondest memories actually were going to the Amiga DevCon in Orlando, which was the first and only American DevCon I ever made it over to, and it was the one that they were previewing all the new 32-bit graphics chips, and in particular, this was before the 4000 and so on came out, and there was the AAA chipset. And I actually got to see a prototype of the AAA chipset, which did exist and was real, but sadly never made it into production. But there was such a buzz there, and there was such a cool group of people there. Now, it's not like hanging with all the cool kids, but all the people there were just so invested in Amiga, so easy to talk to, and it was just a really great experience. So that would definitely go down as one of my highlights.
Fantastic. Eddy, is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up?
No, the only thing I'd say is thanks to Jarlath and Rob and Luke for hosting me. It's been great to have a chance to, revisit some of the Amiga stuff from my past. I've really enjoyed it, and kudos to you guys for getting the meetups going and the website and so on. And long may it continue.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Eddie. Thank you.
It's been an honor and pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Well, I
Eddie-
look forward to meeting you all in person, hopefully in January, if not before.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Yes, same
Feeling
here.
is mutual.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Eddie's homepage is snoopdos.com. Don't forget you can see videos and photos of Amiga events in Ireland from 2016, 2017 at amigausers.ie. Eddie, again, it's been really enjoyable talking with you. Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone for listening. Until next time, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.